Thank you, Nikki. Thanks everyone for showing up. Nice audience, love it. I'm going to talk about comparative government as a study, but I will make an argument that just comparing is no longer good enough. First off, we always compare. We do that by habit. We subconsciously register what we wear, the color of our hair, the make of our car. We continuously compare. When it comes to governments, the first time that people start more systematically to compare is with Aristotle, when he is looking at a number of city-state constitutions. That is to say, you use that term in a somewhat broader sense, not constitution as we understand it to be a legal document, but he compared constitutions. He focused mainly on the relationship between ruler and ruled. It wasn't on political administrative systems at large and how they emerged. That was done for the first time by Ibn Khaldun in 1366. I have it upstairs for those of you who are interested in reading it. It's actually a damn good book. The Muqaddimah, or A History of the World. And to my great surprise, and I've had that experience quite a few times, that I think, oh gosh, a novel idea, and then somewhere in the months ahead or years ahead, I find out that someone else thought about this. So, I have an interest in the history of government, right? And one of the things that I know fairly well is literature on the development of government. So one of an American anthropologist by the name of Elman Service came up with this idea in 1962 that people started to live in ever larger communities, from band to tribe to chiefdom to state. And I thought, gosh, that's a fairly new idea, I hadn't seen it. Well, 25 years later, that's a few years ago now, I read in the Muqaddimah that same theory, 1366. It does pay off to read a few other languages. Now, this is translated in English, Princeton University Press. My Arabic is a little rusty. More systematic comparative research starts being done in the late 18th, early 19th century, and there's a good reason for that. There was no reason to compare really before the 19th century unless it was out of mere curiosity. The way Aristotle did, the way that Ibn Khaldun did. But people started to compare more systematically because they had the expectation that they would learn from others and then could apply best practices from somewhere else in their own system. The first two journals that I am familiar with are law journals. In French, a French law journal first published in 1814 about German state and administrative law, and at the same time, a few years later, in Germany, a comparative journal on French state and administrative law. Now, why would the Germans be interested in French state and administrative law, respectively the French in German state and administrative law? Well, as you know, these countries bickered with one another. And one of the territories that swapped sides over the centuries is Alsace-Lotharingia. And when that happened, if you were a French territory, the Germans took you, you had to adapt your house, your stores, to the German building codes. And it then so happens that a generation later, the French take it back and you have to redesign your house according to the French building codes. There was every reason to compare for those people in Alsace-Lotharingia. In the course of the 19th century, it becomes more and more common that governments send out some of its employees to other parts of the world to see what they can adopt from elsewhere. Dorman Eaton, as you know, went charged by the American president for a year to England to learn about the Northcote and Trevelyan reforms of the civil service, to see to what extent these reforms could be applicable in the United States. What many people know is that in 1883 the Pendleton Act came out of that effort. What very few people know is that Dorman Eaton paid out of his own pocket for that entire year. The American government did not pay him anything. That's public spirit, if I ever saw one. Then there is, in the Meiji period in Japan, the Japanese government sending out civil servants all over Europe because they want to reform their political and administrative system in to something that is more Western. Rapid modernization in Japan. So what did they do? The Japanese adopted the British style of organizing the Navy. The British telegraph system, the British postal system. They copied from the French and the Germans the army. The primary school system was copied after France. The judicial system after France. The national banking system came out of the United States. The Bank of Japan was modeled after its namesake in Belgium. They swarmed all over Europe and they simply copied what they believed to be the best practice. Transportation, no surprises there, was copied from the Germans. Now, so we compare for utilitarian reasons best practices. And we still do that, but I argue today that this is no longer enough. We still do. There's a lot of literature, comparative-wise, in the world. But we need a little more, I think, than that. We also compare for theoretical reasons. That's something that emerges in the course of the 19th century, but much more so in the 20th, that we like to compare in order to find, are there any regularities, any law-like generalizations that we can make. We will never emulate what the natural sciences have been able to do with gravity and magnetism, but comparison does help us to find similarities between systems, and I'll emphasize it a little more. We compare also to legitimize. A lot of countries or a lot of people compare in order to show, look, this is not a bad system. And I find myself living what I call living a comparative perspective. I'm a Dutchman. I'm hardwired Dutch. I will never ever change. People ask me in the Netherlands, have I become an American citizen? No, and that kind of surprises me. If I'm 18 and move to the United States, then I might consider becoming an American citizen. But I was 42 when I came here 16 years ago. And so I cannot shake that Dutch thing anymore. But we legitimize. I find that I understand things about the Netherlands far better, having lived here, seeing things that I didn't see living there. And I flatter myself thinking that I see things about the United States that Americans don't see themselves because it is so, taken for granted, so normal or what have you. Finally, there's a civilizing element to comparison. It civilizes us in the sense that, and I quote an article by Fitzpatrick and others in our last issue of PAR, that comparison counteracts tendencies of parochialism. It will add some degree of humility to your understanding of the larger world. Now, in my office I have a lot of comparative books. And what characterizes the comparative literature is that it's extremely fragmented. For one, there are books, they are called comparative government, but they're basically about comparative political systems. So this is an example. I've had a whole shelf full left back in Oklahoma, but it's comparative political systems. So party politics, election administration, everything to do with the political system. It's called comparative government, but there's hardly any attention for bureaucracy, which after all accounts for 98 to 99.5% of the total public workforce. Comparative politics. There are comparative policy books. I have another one upstairs that I use in a comparative policy class, Adelino and Blake. This is a large N study. Francis Castle's an Australian, does a lot of welfare state studies, so a lot of statistics. Comparative policy, and then there is comparative public administration. This is, I think, the best book that has been written thus far. 2001, Farrell Heddy, 6th edition. Farrell died a few years ago. He was part of a comparative project that we are still doing, now in its 24th year, comparative civil service systems. The literature is fragmented. Policy, administration/management, and politics are seldom put together in one volume, and that is exactly what my colleague Iran and I have done. It's also fragmented the literature between Western and development administration. A lot of comparative studies are about Western countries, what Farrell Heddy called the classic systems: France, Germany, England. For good measure, we throw in the United States and Japan, Russia every now and then. Development administration is an entirely separate literature. That if you're in development administration, you don't do Western and vice versa. These people, these audiences don't really talk with one another. There are literatures fragmented along the lines of large N studies, statistical, quantitative, versus in-depth studies, more thick description style, as Clifford Geertz did. But large N studies, comparative, can be combined with descriptive in-depth studies, and that is something that Eleanor Ostrom and her folks across the globe have done over the decades. Comparisons are also limited to what Adelino and Blake called families of nations. So Tom Christensen and Per Lagret do a lot of comparative studies of Scandinavian countries. Robert Burns used to work together with Bidya Bovornwatana, University of Chulalongkorn. Bidya died last year, totally unexpected, but they do South Asian countries, comparative. In Latin America, I know there are people, scholars, doing comparative studies, but they seldom take the trouble of writing it up in English. So in Spanish, it's not very accessible. I know at least one person in the United States, or two, who can access that literature because they happen to be fluent in Spanish. So fragmentation according to families of nations as well. Ladipo Adamalekun, Nigeria, he'll do comparative studies of Africa, but I don't know how many people here have read comparative studies about Africa. I have, of Asia, of Latin America, but it's not always so easy to find. Fragmentation of literature, of our understanding of the world, also because we are limited in our understanding of languages, our mastery of languages. That's especially the case in the United States. George Candler, who has his PhD from Indiana University, now in North Florida University or something, he speaks Portuguese and Spanish and French. And he can access that kind of literature, and he is one of those people. You can Google him. He's quite visible in the literature. Yeah, he can access literatures that a lot of people can't. Okay, so here's this 6th edition. Farrell dies in 2006, 2007. I could continue using it, but we're now 13 years later. Book needs to be updated, right? So at ASPA in March of 2011, we just sit talking in the exhibit hall, Iran Vigoda, and I had met him before, and I talking about, should we try and update this book? What Farrell Heddy does is combining politics and administration, but policy is not in here. So as we talk, we thought, we need to have something different, not because we need to have new for the sake of novelty, but there is something about globalization that calls for a different approach, but the more traditional comparative study, where you pick a number of countries, you reason out why you picked that number of countries, and then come across as totally clever and smart, and then have some law-like generalizations at the end. We do that too, but we have done it quite differently, as you will see. First of all, we talked about what globalization then means and what kind of an approach we should take in a book that tries to cover the entire globe, because Farrell Heddy does the entire globe, and he's one of the very, very few who managed to do that. So we wanted to do that as well. But what does it mean if we say that our approach is not just comparative, but has to do something with globalization? So we talked a little about what globalization means. First of all, globalization, we're living in a very small world. If you watch the news in the morning, something can happen in Japan and we know it 5 minutes later. Yeah? The width of social time has been reduced to mere seconds. Sorry. What that concept means, let me illustrate. Here's a guy, 20-year-old kid, moves from Bergen, Norway, to the Midwest, say Indiana or Ohio, somewhere in the 1860s. And once he has found a place to live and a job, he's writing his mom and dad, "Mom, Dad, I have safely arrived in Columbus, Ohio," and he describes his life here. He puts a stamp on the letter. It goes off by boat to Bergen, Norway, where they received that letter 40 days later. This is a true story, by the way. Mom and Dad read the letter, are elated to hear from their son, and they write immediately back 40 days after. the boy gets that letter. The width of social time is 80 days in the 1860s. Our width of social time is mere seconds. And that must mean something, right? We have intertwinement of economies and growing influence of multinational and private corporations. That is an element of globalization. We thought there is some degree, possibly, in the eyes of some people, of cultural imperialism. We talked briefly about it last week, Anand and I, about the Washington Consensus. The idea that economic policies of developing countries should adapt to the guidelines of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the United States Treasury Department. Created a lot of havoc. You can Google it. But some argue cultural imperialism. Some people fear that globalization leads to homogenization of cultures, something that they have come to call McDonaldization of the world. Well, that may be true, but in my experience, at the same time, people are much more aware of their differences because of that globalization. People are much more aware of their differences because they see how people elsewhere live. There was a time where people didn't know what was going on 20 miles away from their home, and that is not that long ago. Another element of globalization is English as the general language for education, in transportation, in academia, and in business. And is there then such a thing as globalization with regards to government? Well, yes, there is. Some say that economic globalization leads to hollowing out of the state. I'm one of those who doesn't believe that for one bit, because the state is the only actor left that can make authoritative decisions on behalf of the entire population. No other actor can say that they do that in any given society. There are some collective public challenges that are global by nature. Think of terrorism, sex trafficking, migration, etc. Yeah? That global perspective. I now need my slides. Where's Alex? Alex put them on slides for me. Thank you very much. Okay. We like to combine a global and a comparative perspective. For reasons of there is globalization and it must mean something. Now, just imagine, and that's what I'm describing in the end of this first chapter, just imagine that you take off and you want to see something over the globe as a whole, right? Not a few countries, not a family of nations, but I want to look at the globe as a whole. So I'm going to cruising altitude, 30,000 feet up, and I see the entire globe. What do I see? Well, for one, I see something that's really interesting, and that is that there is no part of the globe left, or it is administered by circumscription. This is the world. Can I write on this? Huh? Here, the world. As I see the cruising altitude. If I fly cruising altitude 10,000 years ago, there are no jurisdictions. Nothing. People simply roam the globe in small pockets of 25 to 30 people. Biologists, evolutionary biologists found out that this is about the maximum size that any human population, if it is nomadic, can survive. If it gets larger, it happens with monkeys as well, groups larger than 30 to 35 will split in two. And then they'll continue to grow to, again, 30, 35, and then split up again. Now, the entire globe is common land 10,000 years ago. Now, we know that when people domesticated plants and animals, and we don't know exactly what caused that, if describing jurisdictions is something that was a consequence of that process of domestication, but we became, at some point in the history of humanity, sedentary. So we have small pockets where people define a territory, okay? So here's a territory and there's a state, a city-state. So the rest of the earth is still common land. It's empty. It's no one's property. If you look at one general trend across the globe, is that slowly the entire landmass of the earth is circumscribed by jurisdictions. And that from national down to the local level. Complete until around the time of the Second World War. where they have calculated that there are some 100,000 polities about 5,000 years ago, so political systems, city-states. Right now, I think we all know how many states there are in the United Nations, about 192, 194. So as the earth is slowly gobbled up in jurisdictions, carved up in jurisdictions, the number of political systems goes down. So that's something that I can see at cruising altitude. If I do a simple comparative study of a few countries, I will never see that. Anyway, let me see. Yeah, this process was completed, I said, around the time of the Second World War. There's a really good book by the anthropologist James C. Scott. It was published in 2009. And in it he showed how the mountainous regions of southern Asia, stretching from India, northern India, all the way to China, Vietnam, how the state was not able to successfully penetrate those mountainous regions. People could literally flee from the state, from the long arm of the state, avoiding to pay taxes, for instance. That is no longer possible. There are no parts of the world left where the state is not able to penetrate effectively, for instance, for reasons of taxation. Okay, that's chapter 1. Section 1 of that book, it's about, with the bibliography, about 220,000 words. The first part of the book is about the development of government and what has spread across the globe. The second part of the book is about a variety of policy areas, as you will see. So here, what type of associations have there been in history? Governing associations. I don't have time to go in detail into this because there's a whole lot of stuff in the book. This is important to remember. Most of the comparative studies are written top-down, but that is not how governments emerged. They emerged bottom-up, and it is the same mechanism everywhere in the world. And that's something that I show here. And then territorial states, a global model of the development of government. So a model that works, that describes the emergence and development of government wherever you go in the world, wherever. It has always been the same at any time. I know there's variation, but that variation is mainly variation in terms of the policy process and who has access to policy making and who has veto power. There is variation there. But at that cruising altitude level, then you can see the same thing happening everywhere. And what is that? First of all, we start to treat people, when they become sedentary, start to treat land as property. Yeah? So there is a nice quote in Jean-Jacques Rousseau, The Social Contract, yeah, that the first person to put up a fence around him and said, "This is mine," is the start of all our problems. And I think Rousseau was right, because if you say this piece of land is mine, it's no longer yours, right? So governments emerge to define territoriality and property. The two are very closely related. Yeah, there's not much else that I can say, but one thing that we have everywhere is governments territorialize, define jurisdictions, and they operate by means of bureaucracies. And when these governments become a little more effective at extracting resources from their population, that is usually in labor and in kind, and later then in money, they get bureaucracies. In chapter 8, I make an argument why I think we stereotype bureaucracies and why we are suspicious of bureaucracies. And that is because for most of history, for thousands of years, bureaucracies were the instruments in the hands of the few who were powerful. 95% of the population was disenfranchised. They had no vote. They had no political power. And bureaucracies were extractive. They extracted resources. They did not provide services. In our day and age, the past 2 centuries, bureaucracies actually start providing services, and ever more. So I think the distrust people have of bureaucracy, and Americans have that more, say Gary Wills, than Europeans do, but still there is something that is in our collective psyche. Historically, bureaucracies were oppressive, and most regimes went down if the bureaucracy became too extractive. Now, speaks for itself. State and nation building. Here's political systems. And then bureaucratic organization. And the origin of our stereotype. That's what I was just mentioning. Public management, we cannot get around it, of course. We think in terms of levels, Iran and I. So at the constitutional level, what constitutes society at large? That's the first several chapters. Then at the collective level, we look at the decision-making arenas and who have access over time. And then here we look at day-to-day operations, public management. In this chapter, and then here is a chapter on civil service systems and political administrative relations. Then we go to the second part of the book, and that's the unusual part. And quite honestly, it's the part that makes me anxious to hear what comments people have once they read it. Because I mentioned that systematic comparisons are usually done between familiar countries. In our civil service project, we developed a theoretical perspective with people like Farrell Heddy, Jim Perry, and others. And then that theoretical framework came out in a book in 1996. That was the basis for a series of comparative studies. So we have one book on Anglo-American systems, civil service systems, one on Asia, one on Western Europe, and one on Central and Eastern Europe. Yeah? And we had a conclusion to that project in 2007 to see what had changed in even the past 10 years or so, and that volume will come now out as a second edition, more theoretical reflection on what has changed in civil services, civil service systems. This book, the first part of it, I've done a separate volume that should be out later this year or early next year on public administration and the state. And that's then mainly a focus on the Western world, not the whole world. But the second part makes me a little nervous because we have dropped simply the idea that any comparison can be systematic. Yeah? I wouldn't even call it the most different systems design, the way John Stuart Mill developed it. But here we go. We organized 4 chapters with policy areas, the traditional areas. We start with the oldest government tasks, functions, if you will. So that's army and police and justice, military, police and justice. Well, you can see here, France, Israel, the USA, Colombia, South Africa and Britain. Yeah? And we don't even argue anywhere why we pick those. We simply think it is interesting. Yeah? And we want to go from cruising altitude, nosedive into, in this case, France's professionalization of the army, or the America's challenges with FEMA. And then we leave that country again, go back to cruising altitude, pick another country for another topic. But where they meet is at the end of a chapter. Here. And what we find in all those chapters is that the reforms of the past 15, 20 years in any policy area is heavily influenced by management thinking, that is, operational level thinking. Our reforms are seldom focused, certainly not in the Western world, seldom focused on reforming the political administrative system, which is the case if countries shift from a dictatorship to a democracy, as happened with Portugal and Spain in 1975, right? Germany and Japan had to change their political administrative system after the Second World War with a lot of American influence. Yeah? But other than that, we don't reform anything else but at the operational day-to-day management thing. And that comes out in all those chapters. So here, China, the UN, and Germany. I'm going to the chapter on economy, finance, and taxation. Yeah. So Romania, Spain, Greece, Iran, Denmark, Belgium, and Estonia. And then reforms in economy, finance, and taxation, heavily influenced by ideas with regard to new public management. Social economic services, so energy management, planning, zoning, industry. I'll let it speak for itself. Yeah. We simply picked countries that we thought were interesting, and there are 2, we have the United Nations Security Council in California, Wisconsin, because there was something that we thought was interesting there. And then here, planning and zoning, a number of countries. And then chapter 12 is healthcare. And these countries are picked. See, Australia is of course picked because it is a system much more like the American system with a private market, whereas the Netherlands is a heavily publicly controlled healthcare market. Yeah? Singapore is somewhere in between. I mean, there is a reason that we pick these cases. But so here's Wisconsin for vouchers. China we had twice. And then Social Security. And that's the end of that. Yeah. So we'll see. It's a book that is not written as a textbook. I'm sure the publisher hopes it is Jossie Bass who is taking it. Publisher hopes that it will sell as a textbook, but it is written, I think, as something that tries to reach practitioner audiences, because there's another fragmentation. You remember that I mentioned in the beginning how a lot of comparative research is fragmented, right? Well, it's also fragmented to the fact that practitioners and academics don't seem to be actively exchanging information with one another, which used to be quite normal until the 1960s. I've taught a lot of people, adults over the years, military, diplomats, political office holders, civil servants from all over the world. Yeah? Civil servants, as they traveled 1.5 centuries ago to other parts of the world, they now need to have some understanding what globalization means for their governments. I haven't quite figured it all out yet, but at least I can show where we came from and where we are right now. What it actually means and how we can act upon it is another matter. So it's written as a different way of looking at the world. Yeah. What makes this book, I think, fairly unique is that it's not limited to literature in public administration and political science. We have excessively used evolutionary biology, anthropology, history, as you can imagine, law, economics, archaeology, whatever informs our understanding of government. It is literature that is very seldom brought together. If you want to take a look in my office, I have articles you won't believe that they were written. Yeah? That stuff about the group size, that humans have the same as monkeys, I have from an anthropologist in Britain, Dunbar. And that group size of 30 has everything to do with the fact that people, monkeys, do flee each other. They are 70, 60, 70% of the time, they pick each other's hide and get the fleas out. This is how they get to know. I'm serious, folks. This is how they get to know each other. How you know that this monkey is a friendly one. That's an aggressive one. This is a meek one. That's, yeah. People, Dunbar argued, 2 articles in 92 and 93 in journals that you otherwise wouldn't see. But people have found, he argues, a different way of getting to know one another, and that is language. Language is our shortcut to getting to know each other, and we can live together in very large communities, in imagined communities, or I kind of like that Benedict Anderson called it imagined communities, but Bertrand Russell beat Benedict Anderson by at least 50 years in the Scientific Outlook in 1932, when he writes about artificially created societies. It's a whole chapter. Yeah? So we can live together in large communities of people because we have language, and we have government. We cannot do without government because we have such large groups of people. I don't know you. So if I think you have a nice sweater, I'm going to take your sweater. I don't know you. Why would I care? Yeah, about you. So we have government because this is how we manage to interact with one another. I know that there are people who don't like government. I love it. And it's not because you don't bite the hand that feeds you. It's simply that we cannot do without government. It is impossible. Anyone who makes the argument that it is just plain nuts. Questions? It took us about 2 years to write, and the last year was just cutting away because the publisher was complaining about the size. Jason.
You had through some of these slides kind of quickly. There was one towards the end of the pack where he talked about the privatization of Chile's social security system.
Yeah.
And there was another one where he talked about Singapore's
Healthcare.
Yeah, the Medicaid initiative. I was wondering, what you might say about these things in the context of this book that might have some resonance for those of us that study social insurance here in the U.S.
Yeah, I read all those chapters and I edited them, formatted them according to publishers' guidelines. But quite frankly, it's a bit of a jumble up in my head. And that has to do with a variety of cases. But I can send it to you, the chapter. Yeah? Social insurance-wise. I'm biased, I suppose. When I read this, I recognized this is a very, very good healthcare system. Yes, sir.
Concerning that very healthcare system, how did the recent, financial upheaval and a lot of the EU countries turning towards austerity, these traditionally, public service areas like healthcare, how were you able to take that cross-sectional look, knowing that there's this big churn going on?
I have to see if I understand your question right. What do you...
Well, I mean, I guess, did you notice that there is this move towards austerity, or it's changing what was traditionally public?
Well, if you talk with anyone from Greece,
Yeah.
or Portugal or Spain, how do they call those countries? There is a derogatory abbreviation, an acronym.
Pigs.
Pigs, right. Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. Yeah. They're drawing a lot from the European Union to get out of their troubles. The Greek now have raised the retirement age from 55 to 58, I believe. I think it should be 75, but it's a good thing that I'm not the Prime Minister of Greece. There is a big rift in Europe. People don't like the German attitude, because it's Germans who are driving basically that call for austerity, but it is necessary, have to. What is striking is that some of these northwestern European countries find that they can defy the rules that they designed themselves, whereas we expect Greece and Spain to uphold them. So some people are truly more equal than others. Yeah.
Well, wait a minute. That's not entirely fair, is it?
What?
Like it or not, one of the reasons that the Germans are so austere, that I think that they speak with such sincerity about this topic, is because they subjected themselves through some very tough reforms in the past 10 or so years. Yeah. And they had the high unemployment rates and the economic dislocation that went along with that.
Yep.
And so you're willing to leave that.
Well, it's not just German economic policy or what some people feel that they dictate in Europe. There's also still some ill will toward Germany about 70 years ago. And Greeks especially have still some bad memories. Yeah, and that plays a role as well, I'm sure. No, fair enough. You're right. Matt.
You opened by saying that you didn't think a systematic exploration of the topic was possible, basically.
Well, not for the whole globe, huh?
Yeah, why? On what basis do you think systematic treatment?
We've picked a number of policies, right? How big is a book? How big would a book be if you do a comparative study of just energy policy alone? All countries, huh? All countries. I have never seen it done. I know comparative healthcare studies, 8 to 10 countries at the most, unless you do quantitative research, and then you can do the whole globe. Yeah, but then what you get is not really a nice detailed description of how something operates in a particular country.
So you mean that a systematic treatment has to include the entire population, basically? Like, in this case, like an N of like 192?
Yeah, or a family of nations, countries that are similar to one another or in the same geographic region. One set of countries that is almost consistently missing in the literature is the Middle East. Comparative. It's coming, but it's not very much yet. Stephen.
You spend a lot of time talking about this sort of evolution from, local governments to maybe more state-oriented government to broader federal government, but that's not the only, this public idea of government is not the only form of government that's existed. There's also, say, church-based governments, which are very top-down, almost from inception. For example, this is like southern Italy, and you talk about how globalization has sort of changed government and governance in sort of public context, but I wonder if you talk in this book or if you just have
no. The title has a global perspective on government and governance. So we talk about here types of governing associations, and that includes sports clubs, churches. Hey, in the United States, there were 500 homeowners associations in 1965. As an example of a self-governing system, there's 265,000 at the moment. Yeah, so that's a serious increase. No, people can govern themselves very well. Yeah, so no, we talk about that.
But do you have any notion of how, in my specific example, I'm talking about the church, how this has changed substantially due to globalization, like the government's mechanisms of the church?
No. There are quite a few people who argue that government is no longer the central actor in society, that other actors govern as well. Well, we know that. Some people say that this has been increasing. I don't think it has been increasing. Governance has always been important. Guilds in the Middle Ages in Europe are self-governing organizations. They even levied taxes and then would pay that on to local governments, or distribute that. There have always been social organizations next to government, always. In our day and age, there are perhaps more. I have never seen a study where governing associations, I would call them, where they count them over time. That would be interesting to see if I could do that. And that homeowners associations have mushroomed the last 50 years, maybe a function of population size and density, But I think they have always been there. And people talk now about a more horizontal way of looking at government and about networking and stuff. People networked 100 years ago. Of course they did. That's what people do. It's simply a different perspective that we have on governing and governance. But it's always been there. Yeah. And there was a time that churches, think of the Catholic Church in Europe in the Middle Ages, had more decision-making authority than governments. Those days are fortunately over. Yeah. Yes, Kim.
You mentioned that the book was written with the practitioner in mind. How do you imagine a practitioner would use the knowledge from this book, or what would you hope that they take away from it?
It's a good question. I know quite a few civil servants higher up in the Dutch civil service who at least once a year travel to another part of the world. My best friend, Richard, I've known him since 1964, was the director of taxation in the Netherlands, right? Car with a fax machine in the back. I remember he had a trip to Australia one year because he'd heard on the grapevine that they had reformed the way that they raised the taxes, and he was very intrigued by what he'd heard. So the Department of Finance pays a trip to Australia for 5 days where he could meet with all sorts of people and then see what could be copied from Australia in the Netherlands. What I liked him to get to take away is especially that remark that Jodie Fitzpatrick and Don Klinger made in PAR, and that is that a global perspective about government teaches us a fair degree of humility, that we cannot simply transplant some of our own systems into another country. If you're interested, I mentioned it I think in chapter 6 or in 8, how they adopted 15 years ago new public management principles in Mongolia. Just Google it for the heck of it this afternoon and you'll see how terribly wrong that went. Because the assumption was that you could simply transplant some public management principles from Western Europe and the United States into Mongolia. It doesn't work like that. And people know that. Howard Aldrich wrote that in 1979. We cannot do it. But we still do. So I would like to get them, a broader perspective on the world in which they live, and not just focus on taxation or on energy policy or on health policy, but they see how all those policies are interconnected and how, in terms of structuring government, we do things quite the same everywhere. Whether you're an island state in the Caribbean or in the Pacific, or whether you are as big as Russia, you know. So it's supposed to educate. It does not. The primary target is definitely not best practices, because who am I to say that this practice is better than that? You know. So maybe that civilizing argument civilizes us. Yes, Charlotte.
Throughout the policy area sections, were you able to come to any conclusions kind of at the end about levels of government that tend to do taxation versus your healthcare throughout the world? So I'm thinking, I'm just thinking, like, teaching a class on just federalism and the examination of which level of government does what.
You should come to my office, or I can loan you a book about decentralization and how you can measure decentralization. Now, there are systems in the world, and America is one of them, the United States, where taxation is fairly decentralized, and where there's quite a bit of revenue generation at the local level. Yeah? The Netherlands, on the other hand, 89% of local revenue is nationally raised through taxes. Local governments can hardly generate any revenue. Now, does that mean that the Netherlands is highly centralized and the United States is highly decentralized? No. You cannot say that a country with any policy area, and that's certainly the case for taxation. I have a nice comparative study by Guy Peters on taxation, if you're interested. There are multiple measures by which you can assess whether something is decentralized or not. And in the case of the Netherlands, taxation is very, very centralized. But how it is spent is almost left to the local level. National government only provides framework legislation, and local governments can simply spend the way they see fit. So there are no lessons that you can draw other than to say that the Netherlands is centralized, or Germany, or Sweden, and the United States decentralized is infantile. So I basically cannot answer your question.
What if can you go the other way around? With more taxation for a minute, something, any thoughts on whether, if there's similarities in which level of government countries are handling policies, more other types?
Generally, Asian countries are more centralized. Northwestern European countries are more decentralized. North America is more decentralized. Latin American countries are more centralized. African countries are more centralized. But those are generalizations, because in each of those world regions there is variation. Chile, for instance, is more decentralized than, say, Argentina. But it's all relative. Rob.
What about trends? So we saw over the weekend, Scotland, regardless of how the vote turns out,
51% now says to separate. I heard yesterday.
And even if they vote no, they've won some autonomy in terms of their own taxation.
Yeah, and I believe that the same has been done with Wales several years ago, and I wouldn't see why that wouldn't be possible. Is there a trend of territories seceding from country? The Basques would like in Spain. I know the Kurds would like. Syria, Turkey, and Georgia, Russia, would like to have their own country. Yeah, but the Frisians in the Netherlands really don't want to separate from the Netherlands, even though it's a totally different language. Yeah, I wouldn't say there is a trend. If there is a trend, it is, I find it astonishing to see how widespread the application of new public management principles is. And that reform focuses on really small potatoes. They don't look at the political administrative system at large. No one dares to touch that. Yeah. And I don't know how long that's going to last. I have no idea. Nothing else? Well, then thank you very much. It was a pleasure. It'll be out